Okay, so I gotta tell you, I got here a little early today, and honestly, the energy in the room is just, wow, you won't believe it. But our guest just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and it totally caught me off guard, in the best way. We're about to dive into something really deep, something that's gonna make you think differently about a lot of things. His new book, The Eclipse of God, is at the heart of it. And trust me, this conversation, you don't wanna miss a second. So, let's start with the title itself. The Eclipse of God. At first, you might think, okay, is this just some fancy metaphor? But no, it's actually really powerful. Picture an eclipse in the sky. The moon slides between the earth and the sun, right? And here's the thing, the sun doesn't stop shining. It's just that its light is blocked. That's exactly what's happening with God in our culture. According to the book, the moon of secularism, as it's called, is coming between people and the light of God. The light hasn't gone anywhere. It's still blazing, but people can't see it. And that hits hard because, like Isaiah 59 points out, it's not that God is deaf or distant. The separation comes from our own actions, iniquities, distractions. All that stuff kind of blind us to Him. And here's where it gets really personal for America. So many people say, yeah, I believe in God. And they're sincere, I think. But often the God they're believing in, it's the one they pick. Or worse, the God is basically themselves. That's the crux. People are shaping God to fit their culture, their comfort, their convenience. And meanwhile, the real God, the one in the Bible, the one the book is pointing to, is still there, shining. And the author's heart here is clear. He wants to help people break through that eclipse, to actually see and follow the God of the Bible, not the gods handed to us by popular culture, social trends, or our own personal preferences. It's urgent, because when that eclipse takes hold, darkness comes into the land. There are no guardrails, people flounder, morality blurs, and direction is lost. And that's why this book isn't just a read, it's a wake-up call. It's about reconnecting with something real and solid, something that can guide, correct, and illuminate. So yeah, the imagery works on multiple levels. It's celestial, it's dramatic, but most importantly, it's a clear metaphor for the spiritual reality we're living in today. And as we go on, you're gonna see just how deeply that idea threads through everything else in the book. Alright, so now we get into one of the really fascinating parts of the book, this whole idea of Nietzsche declaring that God is dead. I mean, just imagine the boldness of that statement at the end of the 1800s. He's not talking literally, right? He's talking about culture, philosophy, society turning away from God. And from there, the book dives into these three major thinkers who kind of paved the way for that idea: Marx, Darwin, and Freud. Each one, in their own way, challenged God's authority and what he represents. Marx, for instance, attacked God as ruler, framing systems and governments without God as the lens. Then there's Darwin, who, with his theory of evolution, kind of flipped the whole idea of creation on its head. The book points out this startling implication. If humans are just evolved animals, then what stops us from justifying things like abortion, euthanasia, or treating life as disposable? It's a bit unsettling when you really think about it. And then there's Freud, who focused on human desire, particularly sexual pleasure, and argued that God's rules were unnecessary restrictions. Together, these three thinkers set up a cultural shift where God isn't central anymore. Morality becomes relative, and society starts questioning any fixed sense of right and wrong. And here's the part that really caught my attention. The book illustrates this with real-world changes. In Europe, many cathedrals that were once sacred spaces have now become bookstores, libraries, mosques, or even nightclubs. Yeah, seriously. Places that were designed to point people to God are now just, well, secular spaces. And the author isn't just making an observation, he's drawing lessons for us today. Think about it. When a society loses sight of God, the values, the guardrails, the ethical compass, it all starts to blur. And the book connects this to universities and cultural institutions. These are places that shape young minds, right? And when the dominant narrative shifts away from God, it trickles down into education, ethics, and even everyday life. It's like watching a slow eclipse over society itself. But here's the thing, while it sounds heavy, the book doesn't just leave us there. It's pointing out patterns and causes, showing how the death of God in culture is not just a philosophical statement. It has tangible effects on how people live, what they believe, and what they consider moral. And throughout this section, the tone is conversational, almost like the author is walking you through Europe, pointing out these cathedrals and saying, look at this. This is what happens when society drifts away from God. It's eye-opening, and it really sets the stage for why reconnecting with the true God, as the book urges, is so urgent, okay? So this part called Nearer My God to Me is really fascinating because it digs into how people end up following the gods of popular culture instead of the real God. And here's the thing, modern culture loves this idea that God is endlessly tolerant, totally non-judgmental, right? But the book really pushes back on that. It reminds us of the Old Testament where God's power and might are front and center. He smote the Egyptians, judged Sodom and Gomorrah, and yes, that sounds intense, but it's all about justice and the seriousness of sin. The danger comes when we twist God into this super soft, friendly figure and ignore his standards. People start thinking, well, God is tolerant, so I can just do whatever I want, and that leads to all sorts of moral confusion. And the author really drives this home with a powerful image from Isaiah. It's like going to bed hungry, dreaming you've eaten, and waking up still starving. That's what happens when we worship the wrong gods. We think we're fulfilled, but we're really empty. And it's not just about personal choices. It bleeds into society, culture, and even laws when God is misunderstood or replaced by something more convenient. The book challenges us to face the reality of God's wrath as well as his love, showing that both are necessary to understand the fullness of his character. It's kind of like the author is leaning in and saying, hey, look closely, don't settle for a watered down version of God, see him for who he really is. And once you start to grasp that, it becomes clear why these misunderstandings can be dangerous, not just for individuals, but for communities and even nations. The key takeaway is that reconnecting with the God of the Bible, understanding his power, his standards, and yes, even his judgment gives clarity, guidance, and real moral grounding. It's eye-opening, and the book delivers it in this very conversational, almost one-on-one way, making you feel like you're right there, being walked through some seriously important truths. Alright, moving into part 2 of the book, this is where things get really practical. It's all about returning to the true God, the God of truth, of creation, and of moral absolutes. And honestly, that word return is key here, because what we're seeing in secular society is a huge shift towards subjective morality. People say things like, well, morality is personal, it's relative. And at first, it might sound reasonable, right? But the book shows the consequences. When everyone decides their own moral rules, society starts drifting, standards collapse, and chaos creeps in without people even realizing it. Chapters 7 through 9 really drill this home. Returning to the God of truth means accepting that there's a reality bigger than us, that there are principles that don't change just because we feel differently. Returning to the God of creation is about recognizing that life itself isn't random or accidental. There's intention, design, and order. And then, returning to the God of moral absolutes, that's huge. It's about acknowledging that right and wrong aren't just opinions, they're anchored in something eternal. The author really makes you think, like, what happens when we ignore that? When morality becomes a matter of preference rather than principle? Decisions in law, education, and culture start to lose their foundation. And that's when you see all the ripple effects, debates over ethics, laws that shift based on public opinion, and a general sense of instability in what's right and wrong. But here's the thing, the book doesn't just leave you hanging with problems. It guides you through why reconnecting with these truths is so important. It's kind of like the author is saying, look, this isn't about strict rules for the sake of rules. It's about building a solid framework so we can navigate life wisely, make real choices, and understand what really matters. And the way it's written, conversational, almost like a chat over coffee, makes these big, heavy ideas surprisingly accessible. Now, you start to see why returning to God in these 3 key areas isn't just spiritual, it's practical, moral, and deeply relevant for how we live today. Okay, now chapters 10 and 11 really hit on something huge. God as lawgiver and the idea of transcendent laws. And here's why this matters. The book gives this striking example from Nazi Germany. When the Allies were trying the Nazis, the question came up, by whose law? German law, British law, American law. The Nazis argued they hadn't broken any laws because Hitler had made their actions legal. And that's where the concept of transcendent law comes in. The idea that there's a law above any human law, universal principles that apply to all people, all cultures. And the only reason you can even believe in such laws is because God exists and reveals them. They don't just spring up from society. Then the book ties this back to scripture, like Isaiah 59, which talks about justice being unable to enter when truth stumbles in the public square. It's a warning that without God's standards, legal systems can drift, and justice becomes whatever people decide it should be. And this isn't just history, there are modern examples too. You've got concepts like marriage justice or economic justice, where if there's no transcendent standard, society decides what justice looks like based on opinion or trend rather than truth. And the author makes this really clear. When we conflate what's legal with what's moral, it's a slippery slope. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. And if we forget that, we start elevating human opinion over God's law. The book drives home why returning to God's principles is so critical for individuals, for communities, for nations. It's not just abstract theology, it's the foundation for real justice, fairness, and order, and the way it's explained, with pauses, examples, and little moments to let the weight sink in. It feels like the author is walking you through history and modern society at the same time, helping you see why anchoring laws and morals in something bigger than ourselves is not just important, it's essential. Without that, we risk repeating mistakes of the past and losing a sense of right and wrong entirely. Alright, so now we're diving into one of the most intense parts of the book, God's wrath and grace. And I promise, it's not as heavy as it sounds. It's actually fascinating once you start unpacking it. The key idea here is that we can't just think of God as unconditional love without also understanding the seriousness of sin. The book makes this really clear using Romans 1 as an example, showing how deeply sin can warp the human heart if it's left unchecked. And here's where it gets really striking. The author shares stories of Nazi leaders who, despite the horrific things they did, actually came to accept the gospel because they were confronted with the reality of their sin and the grace of God. It's shocking, right? But it illustrates the point perfectly. Grace isn't really sweet until sin is bitter. You have to recognize the depth of what's wrong before you can fully appreciate what God does through forgiveness. And that leads us to what the book calls the scandal of grace. I love that phrase because it's so, well, provocative. It's scandalous that God can forgive even the worst sins, yet at the same time, that forgiveness isn't automatically applied to everyone. It's only through acknowledgement, repentance, and faith. The author even points out the paradox. God can forgive a Nazi who believes in him, but he won't forgive a good to decent tax-paying citizen who rejects him. It's uncomfortable. It challenges assumptions, but that's the point. It's meant to make us think and reflect on our own understanding of justice, mercy, and personal responsibility. And what I love about this section is how conversational it feels. The author isn't lecturing, he's almost guiding you through the story. Pausing for effect. Letting the weight of these examples sink in. You can imagine yourself sitting there, hearing these stories unfold, feeling the tension between the horror of sin and the wonder of grace. It's reflective. It's a little dramatic, but it's also approachable. You're not just learning about theology, you're feeling the human and spiritual reality behind it. By the end, you really grasp why understanding both wrath and grace is essential. It's not about fear or guilt, it's about perspective, depth, and seeing the full scope of God's character and love in a way that challenges you and sticks with you. So, that wraps up our deep dive for today. And honestly, there's so much more in the Eclipse of God to explore. If this conversation sparked your curiosity, the book is available online and in stores, and it really takes you even further into these ideas. It's one of those reads that makes you stop and think, challenge what you know, and see things from a fresh perspective. Definitely worth checking out if you want to dig deeper and see what insights are waiting for you.